This happened while I was holidaying in Florida, at a motel we had stayed at several times. The first time we stayed here, we were in room 12. While in room 12, we would always hear arguments from next door, and the occupants would always check out, usually within 1 or 2 days, never staying longer. My husband loves America, especially Florida. As it happens, I was to have an operation in Florida, and this was a good time to visit. We checked in at the same hotel, and my husband wanted the room in which we had stayed in before, room 12. Unfortunately, it was taken, so we had to take the room next door. This motel does not have a room 13, so the room is numbered 14. I did feel uneasy about staying in that room. Let's just say a nagging feeling, an intuition which I always trust. By the way, I come from a long line of witches. The reason why I was so uneasy about this was not because of the number, but from remembering the countless couples that came and went from that room. My husband insisted we stay there, since it was next to room 12, and the happy memories of the last holiday we had there. I gave in, and we checked in. We unpacked our things, and from day one, we had an argument the whole entire time we were there. I thought to myself, maybe it was me subconsciously dreading the operation and taking it out on him. But we would be at each other like cats and dogs, to the point in which I walked out of that room a couple of times. The atmosphere would be charged and depressing, and as soon as I walked out, the sun would lift my spirits. My husband is not superstitious, nor does he believe in ghostly encounters. After having my operation, I would have to be bedridden for a week or so, and heavily under the influence of painkillers. While I lay in bed, I would chase my husband away with my bad mood, post-op blues, so I could be left alone and in peace. The time I had alone in that room would stay with me for a long time. Remember, I'd taken some painkillers for my operation. My husband had drawn the curtains so I could sleep. One afternoon, I dozed off and was awakened by the tug of the bed sheets. I thought maybe I kicked it off, so I tried to pull them up. Once I did, I fell asleep again. Again, I was awakened by the feeling of sheets being tugged. I thought it was my husband and woke up shouting at him, but there was no one in the room. I felt the temperature in the room was cold. I shivered and had to force myself in great pain to get out of bed and pull the sheets up. Once in bed, I looked around the room. The strange thing was, it seemed like shadows in the corner, yet it was bright as day outside, and the curtains were drawn, and there were no trees or anything near the window to give off shadows. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for my husband to return. He walked in and got a shock, seeing me all wide-eyed, and thought he had left the air conditioner on, as it was very cool. He walked over and noticed it was off, and blamed that the damn thing was broken. For the whole week while I recuperated in that room by myself during the day, my bed sheets would come off. I would wake up in cold sweats, looking around the room. There was no one there. I felt something brushing my skin, and always felt the shadows in the corner. I put it down to painkillers. They were very mild, and my usually happy self became withdrawn and depressed. I noticed that my husband would come back smiling and was trying to cheer me up, but as we stayed longer in that room, it seemed to have an effect on us. He became mean, and sometimes he would jeer at me. I had enough by this time and wanted to leave. The last night we had stayed there, I had not taken any painkillers, as I wanted to believe I was not hallucinating or seeing things, and believe me, I've seen many things and experienced stranger. I was not sleeping well and looked over to my husband, who slept soundly. The funny thing was, he seemed to be illuminated by something. I tried to touch him, but my hand could not move. I stretched out to him. We slept in separate beds while I was recuperating. He was only an arm's length away, and yet I couldn't move. I was sweating now, with a feeling of dread. My whole body felt like lead, and I could only move my head. I tried so hard to move, yet I couldn't. I could really feel that there was someone or something that was in the room with me, but I couldn't even see them. Someone was there near my bed, but not fully visible yet. I started to say something and tried to call out to my husband. He was dead asleep and did not move. As I turned my head to the foot of my bed, my sheets were being tugged off. I really screamed, but nothing came out. I was forcing myself to say something, but nothing came. At the foot of my bed appeared a tall black outline. The figure seemed to be wearing a hooded cloak, but I had a profile view. It had its outstretched arm on my bed. I'm 6 feet tall, and my feet are slightly stuck out over the bed. I tried to move my feet to kick out, but my limbs were like dead weights. The black-garbed figure turned to me and began to walk towards me. At this moment, I was desperately repeating the Lord's Prayer. I'm not religious, but it came to mind. Over and over, and as it began to walk to me, I remember the eyes started to glow red. At this stage, I was turning my head to and from the figure to my husband, as well as stretching my arm out, trying to touch him to wake him up. I remember him sleeping soundly like a baby. As the figure approached, and I was sweating buckets, and repeatedly said the Lord's Prayer, I yelled out, "Stop!" and that I worshipped only God, and that I belonged to Him. That's when the figure was no longer there. I blinked a couple of times, thinking it was a nightmare, but I noticed that my arm was still outstretched towards my husband, and he was still in the same position, sleeping soundly. I started crying and busted open a stitch. My husband woke up and said that I just had a very bad nightmare. I said I'm glad that we were leaving that very morning. We still go back to the motel, as my husband loves it, yet I insisted we do not stay in that room. Thanks for reading. I grew up on a farm in Missouri. The house we lived in was built around the turn of the century. It was a big 2-story house with a wraparound porch. I shared a bedroom with my brother on the bottom floor. In the summer of 1975, something happened that had a long-term effect on me. It was a clear moonlit night, and you could easily hear crickets and bullfrogs singing in the night. I was sleeping very soundly when something woke me. I had the impression that someone was pushing down several times on the foot of the bed. I looked up and was startled to see the shadow of a short, plump figure watching me. Horrified, I immediately went for the light, but there was nothing there. The figure I'd seen had no face, but seemed to have a soft glow. It was definitely trying to get my attention. I never went to sleep the rest of the night, leaving the light on and reading. The next night, about the same time, I was awake and witnessed a small ball of light zipping around the room. This time I left the light off and watched a tiny orb for about 15 seconds when it finally zipped out of the room. I talked to certain family members later and found out that that apparition that I had seen was probably my great-grandmother. She had died in the same corner that my bed was sitting. In her later years, she began to lose her mind, and instead of putting her in a nursing home, the family decided to take care of her at her home. They hired a male nurse to help her, and at night, the night I saw her, my uncle said she was probably looking for him. The incident disturbed me deeply, and it was years before I could finally sleep well at night. I'm now married and live in another old house, but this one seems to have no past to disturb me. Thank God. In 1999, my husband and I purchased our first home. We had 2 very small children at the time, and soon found out we were expecting our third. We had purchased an old Queen Anne Victorian. It was very large, and all the homes around it were large as well. We had looked at many houses before we purchased the old home. In fact, I drove past the home to go to work every day. I'd never considered buying it, but always felt drawn to it. Things seemed fine. I was alone in the home when I heard what seemed to be a child laughing. I thought maybe our family had come home early, but no one was there. One other time, I was in the cellar getting clothes out of the dryer and heard a child call Mommy, but again, I was alone when this occurred, and none of the neighbors' children were outside. I was lying in my bedroom with my eyes closed and could feel something breathe on me. When I opened my eyes, nothing was there. I have a cat who likes to go outside at night, and one evening, my husband heard her at the door. He opened the door and let her in, or so he thought. The next morning, he saw our cat waiting on the porch for us to let her in. We searched the entire home, looking for the cat he had thought he let in the previous evening, and there was no animal to be found. My daughter, who was 3.5 at the time, would come into our bedroom complaining that the little girl would keep her awake and would not stop playing with the curtains. She would also complain about the man who would whisper by her closet. My mother and I were hanging wallpaper in the family room, which was next to the dining room. My mother was facing the door to the dining area. I had the door to my side. As we were hanging a portion of the paper, we both saw a figure move through the dining room area and into the kitchen. My mother said, "Oh, good, Dan is home. He can help us hang." I called to my husband and asked if he had eaten lunch yet. I got no response. Thinking he could not hear, I went to the kitchen to ask again. He was not there. I called thinking he went upstairs, and still no answer. My mother and I checked the whole house and looked outside for the car. No one was there but her and I. It was a strange feeling. Sometimes lights would go on for no reason. We would hear someone climbing the steps. It was a little unsettling, but we no longer live in the home. We are now building a brand new house. The story that follows is a true account of an 11-year experience that I will never forget. When I was 6 years old, my family moved into an old Victorian home in Pontiac, Michigan. The house still stands today. It has changed owners several times, but is in a state of disrepair. The house had been built in 1892 by a Mr. Newsbrinder for himself, his wife, and children. My parents had purchased the home from Clara, the last living daughter, in hire. I remember moving in that day because even as a young child, I felt a sense of uneasiness. That feeling was soon to be validated. At first, it was more of just an uneasy feeling throughout the whole house. Soon I discovered, though, that the feeling intensified while in my room. It was a large, 4-bedroom home, and us 3 girls all had the luxury of having a bedroom all to ourselves. Mine was in the back of the house, next to my parents' room, and across the upstairs foyer from my other 2 sisters. When alone in my room, I began to feel as though I was being watched. It is a universal, primitive feeling. I would be sitting at my desk doing my homework, or just laying across my bed listening to my stereo, and I would feel it. I felt that a presence was emanating from one corner of my room, up at the ceiling. I had not seen or heard anything up until this point, but that was soon to change. As I was alone in my room again, one day after school, I heard a voice call my name. It was a male voice, and I thought it was my father. I went into the foyer to answer his call, but since he was not home from work yet, it could not have been him. I went back into my room and soon heard the voice again. I say that I heard it, but it occurred to me several years after the fact that I only heard it in my mind. A sort of telepathic communication, I think. It wasn't long before this voice became an everyday intrusion into my life. It would call my name repeatedly. It would assure me that it was okay, and for me not to be afraid. It also told me to come closer to the corner from where it was coming. I remember now that I would be so drawn to it, and would just stand there transfixed, staring at the corner. I never went close to it. Call it instinct, fear, whatever, but I somehow knew better. As I was staring at the corner one day, a huge void opened up in the corner. It was the blackest black I'd ever seen. I saw nothing in the gaping hole, but it seemed to go on forever, and I would grow lightheaded and lost blocks of time staring into it. Now, I told my younger sister all about this, but she never saw or felt anything until we actually moved out of the house, but I'll get to that later. I was afraid to tell my parents, and had been warned by the voice that this was our secret, no need for me to tell. The voice began to torment me. Even at night, as I lay in my bed sleeping, I could feel it there in the dark, beckoning. It invaded my dreams, becoming ever more insistent that I succumb to its wish, that I come into the void. It was angry at me, growling insults and obscenities, but I never would give in. Towards the end of the stay in our house, I began arguing back, telling it that I was stronger than it and would not be overpowered. Strangely enough, over all those years, I'd come to accept its presence as a normal part of life for me. No one ever saw or felt it but me. I'd even confided in my best friend Shirley, who would frequently come for sleepovers. I think she slept with one eye in the corner. The day we moved out, I experienced the most intense terror I will ever feel for the rest of my life. I was then 17. I was in my room, packing up the last few items. I felt the familiar goosebumps and tingling of my skin as the hair on my back of my neck and arms stood up. The voice was at a fervid pitch now, threatening and cursing me. I turned around to face my enemy, stared into the blackness, and was mesmerized to see the most evil eyes I had ever seen come out of the darkness. I could see the whites of his eyes, and the center was like black coal. The whole began to turn, and I heard a deafening roaring sound, not unlike that of a huge waterfall, in close proximity. I dropped what I was doing, ran down the steps, and got into the family car. I left the rest of my things in that room and never looked back. I never heard or saw anything like that again. After we had moved out, my younger sister began having nightmares about something dark and heavy chasing her in our old house. No coincidence, I think. I still get the chills when I think about this. I assure you, this was real. My family and I lived on a farm in Manistee County for 11 years. It is a log home, built sometime in the 1860s. We had numerous experiences, such as the older man talking to my toddler in her bedroom, while knocks on the front door in the middle of a snowy night with no one there, and no footprints in the snow. Heavy footsteps could be heard downstairs when we were lying in our bed on the upstairs landing. A back door was totally jammed shut, and the only thing my husband thought he could do was cut it open. But on a windless night, it just flew open, and there was a strange odor. We had a neighbor across the street tell us that he heard the piano playing when we were gone. I heard my name called often. We had people house sit because we only heated with wood. They heard noises, saw curtains move, and wouldn't stay there again. We saw a figure in my daughter's bedroom window when we pulled away from the driveway. I had a sunburn on my back in the shape of the barn. Now there were no trees or possible shadows, and we even showed a friend, and at the time, it didn't make any sense. Then our neighbor came and said he saw the barn swaying in the wind. At closer inspection, the main supports in the barn were almost completely rotted away. Was this someone's way of telling us something was wrong? There are more stories, but these are some of the best. I'm not lying. These actually happened. And if you don't believe me, well, I guess you're on your own then. But these did happen. Thank you for reading. Phantoms, why don't you share, like, and subscribe? This is a musical, and now we jump up and dance. Phantom, Phantom, he is great. Everybody watches this content, and then they lie and say it's great, but it's really crappy. Just kidding, guys. I wanted to say it was crappy, because then if I said my content was good, I'd have an ego, and I didn't want you guys to worry about that. You don't want to deal with someone with an ego, and eagle's great, and I thought I said eagle for a second, but ego? No. Egos are not for breakfast, or dinner, or lunch, or I don't know what I'm saying, guys. Seriously, disregard everything I've been saying, but seriously, take the moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. I'm not feeling the best right now. My heart is in a tussle. No, I'm just kidding, guys. But I'm not feeling that well. A little under the weather, guys. So if the narration isn't 100%, I'm sorry. But, I try my best. Anyway, guys, love you guys. I'm not going to keep this too much longer than it needs to be. Comment, like, I already said that. All right, guys. Good night, good morning. Love you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.